The official realization came in the middle of a strategic planning session in Berlin, 1944. Reich Minister Albert Speer, standing before the Führer and the shattered remnants of the High Command, placed a single chart on the table. It was not a map of lost territory. It was not a report on casualty counts. It was a statistical table comparing U.S. industrial output versus the entire German Reich. In that cold, unforgiving document, there was one number that defined the true power dynamic of World War II. 14,000. That was the number of combat aircraft the United States had produced in March 1944 alone. In that same 31-day period, the entire Axis, Germany, Italy, and Japan combined, produced less than 4,000. The disparity was not merely an advantage. It was a statistical verdict on total, unanswerable industrial defeat. Adolf Hitler himself was the chief architect of the strategic failure, having repeatedly dismissed the Americans as a nation of weak, disparate consumers. The official German intelligence estimate assured the Führer that, even under full mobilization, U.S. war production would peak at less than 25% of Germany's capacity. This figure was not propaganda. It was the foundation of German military strategy. This was the grand delusion. They looked across the Atlantic and analyzed the market volatility of the Great Depression. They saw civilian commodity production. They did not factor the massive, untapped continental reserve that could, under the formal directive of war, convert its entire private sector capital into an arsenal of unprecedented scale and velocity. This is the story of the strategic arrogance that blinded the German High Command and the forensic data, the steel, the oil, and the aircraft that finally forced them to confront their terrifying truth of America's true power. The German strategic error in assessing the United States was rooted not in cultural bias, but in a catastrophic failure of economic modeling dating back to the late 1930s. To the High Command, the U.S. was a geopolitical abstraction of secondary concern. Adolf Hitler was the chief architect of this error, repeatedly assuring his generals that American soldiers were soft, and more crucially, that American industry had no capacity for sustained mobilization. This concept was based on blitzkrieg economics. The entire Nazi state was built on achieving maximum industrial output before the shooting started, utilizing pre-war stockpiles, territorial conquest, and the highly centralized economy. By 1939, Germany's industrial capacity was effectively running at 85 to 90% efficiency. Their system was designed for a short war, won by decisive military action before the enemy could fully mobilize its economic base. This was the economic foundation of the entire military doctrine. The fatal error was projecting this zero-sum German model onto the decentralized American capitalist system. American industry, by contrast, was built on reserve capacity. In 1939, the U.S. economy was still reeling from the Great Depression. Factories, mines, and shipyards were operating at deeply depressed levels, often less than 50% of their full potential capacity. German planners, fixated on the visible output numbers of 1939 to 1941, mistakenly equated the current output with the maximum possible output. They assumed the industrial ceiling had been reached. They failed to comprehend the terrifying elasticity of the American system, which possessed a vast, cold reserve. Millions of unemployed workers who constituted a massive human labor pool, hundreds of idle factory floors, and critically, an enormous inventory of precision machine tools built in the 1930s, waiting for production orders. Germany had maximized its war economy at the start, forcing compromises and resource scarcity from the outset. The U.S. war economy, conversely, started from this reserve, possessing practically unlimited headroom for exponential, uncontrolled growth. The quantitative evidence of this strategic advantage was readily available, but deliberately ignored by the Reich's strategic economists. Consider the absolute metrics of military power, beginning with steel capacity, the most fundamental determinant of industrial warfare. Germany's maximum annual steel output during the war never exceeded 25 million metric tons. This cap was structural and unmovable. In contrast, in 1940, U.S. steel production capacity was nearly 3 times that of Germany, capable of exceeding 75 million tons annually without breaking a sweat. This difference, the capacity to produce enough steel every year to build the entire German Navy 3 times over, was statistically unsurmountable. Furthermore, the infrastructure that built millions of civilian vehicles was instantly convertible. In 1941, American motor vehicle production was already 7 times the German output. This industrial base was not just volume, it was standardization. The tooling, the assembly lines, the expertise in rapid mass production existed, waiting only for the command to switch from passenger cars to tanks and ordnance. German planners calculated output based on dedicated, specialized war factories. American planners simply converted existing superior infrastructure. The German delusion was that ideological focus and centralized planning were substitutes for raw material volume and economic reserve. They assumed that a nation of 130 million people, driven by profit and consumption, could not compete with the focused military machine of the Reich. They were about to learn that capitalism, fully provoked and unleashed, was the most terrifying, volumetrically superior military asset in history. The Axis bet their entire empire on a short war, blind to the slow, steady hum of the American reserve machine, waiting for the command to mobilize and crush the Reich beneath an avalanche of unanswerable production figures. The German strategic blunder in assessing American industry was catastrophic. Germany was a nation built on synthetic scarcity. The U.S. was a continental power built on natural abundance. This resource control defined the limits of the entire Axis ambition. The most critical resource was oil. Germany possessed almost no native crude oil. They could never produce enough synthetic fuel from coal to power a sustained war. They were always operating on a fuel budget. In 1940, German planners estimated their maximum sustainable oil output at 8.5 million metric tons per year. The United States, by contrast, controlled the resource in a volume that rendered German ambition a footnote. America produced 60% of the world's crude oil in 1939 and ramped that up to provide 80% of Allied oil output by 1943. The U.S. had essentially unlimited strategic petroleum. German tanks were halted by empty fuel gauges. American fleets were powered by an ocean of crude. The disparity extended to the most fundamental elements. Steel. Germany's ability to wage mechanized war was capped at 25 million metric tons annually. The U.S. capacity was colossal. By 1943, U.S. steel mills were capable of producing 90 million tons per year. German strategists could not conceive of a nation that could generate 4 times their capacity. Every German U-boat or tank built was answered by 4 times the tonnage from American foundries. Coal and energy. Germany relied heavily on the Ruhr Valley for coal, a critical and geographically concentrated bottleneck. The American landscape provided massive, decentralized coal and energy reserves strategically invulnerable to attack. The sheer energy output capacity of the American economy fundamentally dwarfed the Axis. The German system relied on brittle, centralized infrastructure. The American system was spread across a continent with mineral wealth. Aluminium, essential for modern combat aircraft. In 1939, Germany was the world's leading producer. By 1944, American production capacity had increased by over 600%, easily outstripping the entire Axis combined. The American goal was simple: flood the market with cheap aluminium, making the production of bombers a matter of sheer scale, not material limitation. The German system, brilliant at managing scarcity, had no framework for processing such overwhelming volume. They failed to realize that the US owned the fundamental mineral and energy keys to the modern world, ensuring German strategic failure regardless of tactical success. The raw material advantage was only the first half of the American verdict. The second half was the production system itself. Germany was hampered by a traditional craft-based manufacturing, focusing on maximum quality per unit. The US deployed a mass production ideology based on speed, standardization, and interchangeability. The most devastating symbol of this systemic shock was in shipbuilding. German U-boats were choking the Atlantic. The American response was led by Henry J. Kaiser, an industrialist who had never built a ship before the war. Kaiser applied the assembly line with brutal efficiency to the largest possible product. He standardized the Liberty ship design and implemented prefabrication. Sections of the hull, weighing up to 100 tons, were welded in different factory bays, then craned into place. This parallel processing decimated production time. A complex cargo vessel that was expected to take 230 days was first cut down to 70 days. The ultimate forensic record of this speed was the SS Robert E. Peary, launched in a documented 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. This speed was enabled by radical standardization. The German ethos favored specialized, customized components requiring skilled Meister craftsmen, creating fragile supply chains. The US system, perfected by Detroit, was based on interchangeability. Every part of a US Sherman tank was standardized, meaning a part fabricated in a Chicago machine shop could be fitted instantly into a tank chassis assembled in California. When Ford's Willow Run facility was converted to bomber production, it became the largest factory floor in the world. It produced B-24 Liberator bombers on a revolutionary mile-long assembly line, blurring the distinction between military arsenal and civilian auto plant. This single facility began spitting out strategic bombers at a rate of 1 per hour by 1944. The German system viewed high-volume standardization as a sacrifice of quality. The American system understood that volume was quality in a war of attrition. The result was a production curve that shocked German planners, a constant accelerating output that transformed raw materials into lethal hardware faster than the German military could destroy it. This was not a war of genius inventors, it was a war of superior, overwhelming process. The direct consequence of the American industrial machine operating at full velocity was the air war. This was the first theater where the German high command confronted statistical defeat. The US objective was the production of 300,000 aircraft over the course of the war. This number, viewed by German planners as delusional, was achieved. The primary American weapons were the heavy bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator. Their success lay not in individual performance, but in the sheer tsunami of volume unleashed upon the Reich. In 1943 to 1944, German manufacturing was forced into a desperate, asymmetric competition. The Luftwaffe prioritized fighter aircraft simply to intercept the incoming waves of bombers. They fought a war of replacement at the tactical level. The Americans fought a war of statistical attrition at the industrial level. The output figures are the forensic proof of German paralysis. The combined Axis output of military aircraft peaked at less than 4,000 units per month. The American response, fueled by plants like Ford's Willow Run, hit 14,000 units in March 1944 alone and averaged over 10,000 per month for most of that year. The key was interchangeability and standardization applied to complex weapon systems. A single B-24 bomber contained roughly 1.5 million parts. At peak output, the U.S. was producing approximately 35,000 heavy bombers over the course of the war, a strategic fleet size that dwarfed the combined operational capability of the Luftwaffe. The German system produced highly specialized, hand-finished fighters, requiring intensive labor. The American system accepted the loss rate inherent in mass production, confident that the factory floor could replace a drowned bomber in less time than it took the Luftwaffe to train a replacement pilot. This volume nullified the German technological edge. When the Luftwaffe produced the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter in 1944, a weapon capable of outrunning anything the Allies possessed, it was already too late. Germany could only produce the Me-262 at a rate of roughly 100 per month due to resource bottlenecks. The U.S. response was to simply flood the sky with 10,000 conventional bombers per month. A ratio of 100 to 1 cannot be overcome by a tactical advantage. The jets were statistically irrelevant. They were crushed beneath the sheer, unanswerable weight of the U.S. production curve. Quantity became the ultimate form of quality. The American production scale was so vast it solved not only the U.S. military's deficits, but also the strategic supply crisis of its major allies. This capacity for simultaneous, geographically disparate conflicts was the true logistical impossibility that broke the German High Command's models. Germany was fighting a single, resource-starved continental war. The U.S. fought a three-front industrial war: the Pacific Theater, the European Theater, and the Lend-Lease program. The volume funneled through the Lend-Lease was not a token gesture. It was a foundational lifeline that directly compromised German operational objectives in the East. From 1941 to 1945, the U.S. provided $50.1 billion worth of materials globally, approximately $800 billion in modern currency. The largest recipient, the Soviet Union, received critical inputs that shifted the war's balance from defense to offensive mobility. While Soviet production focused on simple tanks and infantry weapons, Lend-Lease supplied the strategic high-value logistics required for a mechanized thrust. This was the material necessary to move the Red Army. The U.S. shipped over 11,000 railway cars and 1,981 locomotives to the Soviet Union. This neutralized the German tactic of destroying rail infrastructure, allowing the Red Army to maintain operational depth faster than the Axis could retreat. The most critical material delivered was the military truck. The U.S. provided nearly 400,000 military trucks, including the ubiquitous Studebaker US-6. This mechanized 65 divisions of the Red Army, transforming it from a slow, horse-drawn logistics force into a high-speed, mobile assault army. German generals noted that the Red Army's newfound speed in 1944 was due entirely to American rubber and steel. Beyond land transport, the U.S. delivered over 14,000 aircraft to the Soviets. These were essential not as front-line fighters, but as transports, reconnaissance, and ground support assets, freeing up Soviet production lines to focus on their own tactical fighters. The German planners failed to account for the American machine's ability to act as the primary industrial reserve for three global powers. This reality forced German strategists to allocate resources based on impossible equations. Every Me-109 fighter built to protect the Ruhr had to simultaneously account for the Lend-Lease trucks mobilizing the Red Army on the Eastern Front and the Liberty ships maintaining the supply lines in the Pacific. The American production system did not just defeat Germany, it rendered the entire concept of Axis isolation and siege economics obsolete. They were drowned in American steel, oil, and rubber, delivered via logistical channels that Germany lacked the capacity to interdict effectively. The American victory was fundamentally assured by two structural reserves that German planners entirely failed to quantify: the industrial labor pool and the machine tool inventory. These factors were invisible on any battlefield, but dictated every production schedule. Germany, operating near full employment since 1939, faced a crippling manpower ceiling. Every soldier drafted meant skilled worker loss from the factory. German war planners were forced to rely increasingly on foreign and forced labor, a solution that brought crippling inefficiencies and sabotage. The United States, by contrast, leveraged the devastating legacy of the Great Depression. In 1941, the U.S. had a civilian labor force surplus of 9 million unemployed workers. This massive, trained, and untapped human capital was instantly available. The war did not subtract from the labor pool, it added to it, mobilizing individuals previously considered economically non-productive. The mobilization was statistically staggering. Over 17 million American workers were employed in war industries at the peak of production. Furthermore, the U.S. effectively mobilized women, the Rosie the Riveter phenomenon, into heavy industrial roles. This provided a flexible and rapidly trained labor force that Germany's rigid social structure could not replicate at scale. This labor reserve allowed the U.S. to maintain strategic manpower on the front lines while simultaneously increasing factory output at an exponential rate. The second, and perhaps most critical, invisible asset was the machine tool reserve. The construction of complex weapons like bombers and tanks required vast networks of precision cutting, stamping, and welding machines, the tools that make the tools. German engineers prioritized the construction of specialized, single-purpose machine tools to achieve precise tolerances for specific weapons. This system was rigid. The American system was the reverse. The industrial expansion of the 1930s had created an immense stock of robust, general-purpose machine tools in major industrial centers. When the war began, the U.S. didn't have to wait years to build new infrastructure. It simply retasked existing idle, superior equipment. The conversion was immediate. The numbers are forensic. In 1940, the U.S. had more than 1 million machine tools in operation, a number far exceeding the combined total of Germany, Italy, and Japan. This infrastructure allowed the rapid retooling of civilian automotive plants into war production centers, a feat impossible under the German system. This reserve of machinery and manpower created a terrifying strategic flexibility. When an American bomber plant was damaged, it could be rebuilt or replaced swiftly because the core machine tools were abundant and standardized. When a German factory was damaged, the specialized, irreplaceable tools were destroyed, setting production back months. The U.S. could afford to trade industrial losses for time, knowing its reserves were deeper. Germany could not. The ability to mobilize capital and human labor instantly and at scale was the defining statistical difference between a sustained war machine and an industrial bottleneck. The realization of America's true industrial power was not a single event. It was a process of calculated, strategic paralysis delivered by the Allied bomber fleets. The Germans called the American industrial machine the Great Unanswerable. The U.S. was not trying to win tactical battles. It was systematically destroying the German economy with steel produced at 4 times the Reich's capacity. By late 1943, the American focus shifted from local targets to the systemic destruction of German infrastructure, the core elements that defined their Blitzkrieg economics. This strategy was designed to force a quantitative resource collapse, proving that German reliance on centralized bottlenecks was suicidal. The air campaign was a direct attack on the raw material supply chain. The first and most devastating was the assault on oil, the lifeblood of the mechanized German forces. Since Germany possessed no native crude, its mobility relied entirely on approximately 120 synthetic fuel plants scattered across the Reich, converting coal into fuel. These plants were brittle, complex, and finite. The systematic destruction of oil production became known as the Oil Campaign. The American strategic planners, learning from raids like Ploeshti, focused on the 120 synthetic fuel plants across the Reich. While the Axis was producing 8.5 million metric tons of fuel in 1940, by the end of 1944, U.S. bombing had reduced operational capacity by 98%. The impact was absolute and immediate. The internal logistics proved the point. In June 1944, the Wehrmacht received 800,000 metric tons of fuel. By September 1944, following the peak of the oil campaign, that figure collapsed to just 7,000 metric tons. This massive, unrecoverable disparity meant German U-boats could not sortie, tanks could not move more than 100 miles, and the Luftwaffe could not fly its remaining jets. General Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Armored Troops, noted that operations were being cancelled because of lack of fuel. We are facing the complete paralysis of all war production. The failure to seize oil was compounded by the failure to protect the synthetic substitute. The destruction of the German ball bearing industry served as a second surgical demonstration of America's industrial reach. Ball bearings are the friction-reducing components essential for every tank, aircraft engine, and machine tool. German production was highly centralized, primarily in and around the city of Schweinfurt. The American plan was simple: decentralize the German economy by destroying its friction points. The precision raids on Schweinfurt in 1943 and 1944 forced a crisis. While total physical destruction was not achieved, the disruption was severe enough to cripple assembly lines across the Reich. Speer was forced to divert critical resources, labor air defense, and transport to dispersing the industry into hundreds of small, camouflaged workshops. This dispersal did not solve the problem. It magnified the systemic failure. It forced the German system to abandon the efficiency of centralization, replacing it with the high-cost, low-efficiency, and logistical nightmare of micro-production. The US had destroyed the German economy not by physically leveling every factory, but by forcing systemic inefficiency at gunpoint. The final layer of paralysis was the systematic destruction of the German transportation network. The German war effort was entirely dependent on its railway system to move coal from the Ruhr, bring iron ore from Sweden, and transport finished weapons to the front lines. Beginning in 1944, the air war shifted to targets like marshalling yards, locomotive depots, and key bridges. The resulting logistical chaos was immediate and paralyzing. By the winter of 1944, the volume of coal and raw materials reaching factories dropped by over 70%. Finished goods piled up at production centers because there was no rail capacity to move them. The American ability to produce 14,000 aircraft per month now meant 14,000 aircraft dedicated to shutting down the German supply lines completely. This created a paradox. German factories were often structurally intact, but utterly idle. They lacked the coal to power the machinery, the oil to run the transport, and the ball bearings to repair the assembly lines. The internal reporting within the German bureaucracy confirms the psychological and statistical collapse. Adolf Speer, the man responsible for maximizing German output, was the first to realize the true nature of the American threat. His final reports were not appeals for more men. They were clinical analyses of industrial defeat. Speer realized that the U.S. commitment to volume was a strategic weapon. For every 1 ton of bombs dropped by the Allies, the U.S. manufacturing sector was producing 10 tons of replacement material. The German defense was based on a finite resource pool trying to intercept an infinite stream. The ultimate realization was that American production was not constrained by geography or resource bottlenecks as the German system was. It was constrained only by political will. The U.S. system could absorb any amount of damage and replace it in weeks, an ability Germany never possessed. The German High Command was left trying to fight a war of attrition with a strategic resource deficit of 4-1 in steel, 7-1 in vehicles, and 10-1 in aircraft. This statistical impossibility defined the end of the Reich. They did not run out of soldiers. They ran out of the steel, oil, and transport necessary to equip and move them. The ultimate understanding was that the American factory floor was the true front line, and it was a front line that Germany could not touch. The paralysis was absolute and designed by superior industrial calculus. The final cold accounting of the German failure was delivered by the one man who understood the mechanical truth of the Reich Minister Adolf Speer. His 1944 reports, presented to a high command still believing in tactical miracles, constituted the bureaucratic and statistical surrender of the German war effort. Speer's data proved that the war was not lost on the steppes of Russia, but on the American factory floor. Speer had succeeded in an impossible task. He had rationalized and streamlined Germany's fragmented wartime economy, pushing German arms production to its historical peak in 1944. But this final surge in output was met by an exponentially greater Allied response. Speer's own graphs revealed the statistical gap that could not be closed. Consider the aircraft tonnage comparison, the most direct measure of the air war's outcome. In 1944, German aircraft production reached its maximum efficiency. Yet, the U.S. production curve was so steep that it delivered roughly 3 times the finished airframe weight, measured in metric tons of aluminium and steel, than the entire Axis combined. This tonnage was not merely an infantry figure. It translated into the 10,000-plus aircraft per month that crippled German oil and rail infrastructure. Speer's forensic analysis identified the fatal flaw in German planning, the reliance on localized efficiency. In the autumn of 1944, Speer calculated the damage inflicted by the Allied strategic bombing campaign, largely fueled by American industrial power. The results were devastatingly specific. The air campaign had cut German tank production by 35%, ammunition by 50%, and military vehicle output by 75%. These were not anecdotal setbacks. They were calculated systemic fractures. The Minister of Armaments realized that the problem was not replacement, but time. Germany required a minimum lead time of 6 to 9 months to rebuild a complex synthetic fuel plant or a destroyed locomotive factory. The American machine, driven by its reserve capacity and standardization, could replace the equivalent production capacity in weeks. This meant the Allied bombing campaign did not need to be 100% effective. It only needed to be relentless enough to perpetually push German infrastructure past its critical recovery threshold. Speer's final, desperate attempt to manage the collapse involved the Jägerstab, fighter staff program, an emergency initiative to ramp up fighter production. The program succeeded in building more fighters than ever before, but it failed the war of attrition. The US and UK simply maintained their bomber tempo, forcing Germany to dedicate 90% of its strategic raw aluminium to defense, starving the Wehrmacht of materials for other critical fronts. The US had forced a zero-sum allocation failure. The true final blow, as detailed in Speer's records, was the destruction of the German logistical spirit. The German economic system was based on the premise that resources were finite and manageable. The American system introduced the concept of unanswerable saturation. Speer concluded that the American industrial achievement was not just the capacity to build 14,000 planes per month, but the ability to maintain that volume indefinitely. The German belief in technical superiority, the V-2 rocket, the Me-262 jet, was proven strategically irrelevant. Speer's report was the official acknowledgement that quality cannot defeat quantity when the quantitative difference is 10 to 1 in every decisive metric. The collapse was not military, it was economic. The Reich Minister's report confirmed that the only variable that mattered was the scale of production. The American industrialist had replaced the American general as the architect of the final victory. The war was won by the Allies, but the structural defeat was administered by the American factory floor. The true moment Germany understood America's power was not Pearl Harbor or D-Day, but the day Albert Speer's graphs confirmed the unbridgeable gap. The US produced 300,000 aircraft, 87,000 tanks, and 400,000 trucks while simultaneously feeding the Soviet war machine. Germany, bound by scarcity and centralization, was crushed beneath a statistical impossibility. The American war effort was the definitive, terrifying proof that capitalism, when converted to war, represents the highest form of military power. The ability to wage a war of unlimited industrial attrition. The Germans learned the truth too late. If this forensic dissection of strategic failure and industrial scale was compelling, acknowledge the data by liking this video. Your support is the raw material that keeps this channel running. Subscribe for more untold stories of strategic brilliance and military might. Leave a comment below. What US industrial figure, Kaiser, Ford, or Speer's own data do you believe dealt the ultimate fatal blow to the Reich? Thank you for watching, and thank you for demanding the whole story.